On a freezing night, two hungry wolves appear at the door of a reclusive millionaire, but they are not just looking for shelter. The real reason for their arrival will change everything forever. The wind howled through the cracks of the wooden cabin, creating a lonely symphony that echoed through the corners of the small refuge. Jack Hawkins adjusted the firewood in the fireplace with precise movements, watching the flames dance while his thoughts wandered through the darkness outside. The Rocky Mountains, covered by a heavy blanket of snow, stretched majestically around him, isolating him from the world he had chosen to abandon. At 35, Jack had achieved more than many could in several lifetimes. His still young face, marked by a well-trimmed beard and penetrating green eyes, did not reveal the years of battles in the corporate world that had made him one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the technology sector. But success had its price, and he discovered that in the hardest way. Settling into his favorite armchair, his gaze wandered over the modest environment he now called home. The dark wooden walls housed only the essentials, some rustic furniture, a small kitchen, and an improvised office where he kept his only link to the outside world, a computer connected to the internet via satellite. Not that he used it much, he preferred silence and solitude. The snowstorm that was punishing the region that night seemed especially fierce. The wind whistled more strongly, making the cabin's structure creak in protest. Jack poured himself a cup of hot tea, a habit he had developed since moving to the mountains 2 years ago. The aroma of wild herbs filled his senses, bringing a familiar feeling of comfort. He remembered his last meeting on the company's board when he announced his decision to step away. The stunned faces of his partners and collaborators were still vivid in his memory. "You're throwing everything away," they said. "This is madness," others argued. But for Jack, the real madness was to continue living that life of appearances and empty commitments. A particularly strong rumble brought him back to the present. The storm was getting worse and the darkness outside seemed denser than ever. Jack checked the clock, almost midnight. On nights like this, he used to be grateful for the comfort and safety of his cabin, however simple it might be. That's when he heard it. At first he thought it was just another whim of the wind, but the sound repeated, a soft, almost hesitant scratch against the wood of his door. Jack frowned, placing the cup on the side table. In his 2 years of isolation, he had never received unexpected visits, much less in the middle of a snowstorm. The sound returned, this time accompanied by a low moan, so subtle that it could have been imagination. But it wasn't. There was something or someone outside. Jack got up slowly, his senses on alert. Years of business experience had taught him to be cautious, and that instinct had followed him here. He approached the window closest to the door, cleaning the glass fogged by the contrast between the internal heat and the biting cold outside with his shirt sleeve. The darkness was almost absolute, but his eyes, already accustomed to the penumbra of the cabin illuminated only by the fireplace, managed to distinguish movement on the porch. His heart raced when he finally saw them. 2 maned wolves, their unmistakable silhouettes cut against the falling snow. The characteristic reddish fur of the species was covered in white, and their thin bodies visibly shook. But it was their gaze that truly captured his attention. There was something deeply disturbing in the way those animals were observing him. The larger of the two stayed slightly ahead, in a posture that mixed protection and exhaustion. The smaller, one could barely stand, its legs shaking not only from the cold but from visible fatigue. They showed no aggression, nor did they try to flee. They simply waited. Jack felt a lump form in his throat. His whole life had been guided by logic and reason. Even his decision to isolate himself in the mountains had been carefully calculated. But something in that scene defied any rationality. Maned wolves were naturally shy, avoiding human contact at all costs. What could have led these 2 specimens to seek shelter at his door? The storm roared outside, throwing snow against the oak windows with renewed force. The wolves remained motionless, their eyes fixed on him, as if they understood that their fate depended on the decision of this lonely human. The smaller of the 2 staggered slightly, leaning against the larger one, in a gesture that seemed painfully familiar to Jack. His hand touched the doorknob, and he hesitated for a moment. Years of corporate life had taught him to never trust coincidences, to always look for second intentions behind seemingly innocent actions. But there, in that moment suspended between reason and instinct, something deeper spoke louder. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Tell us which city you're watching us from. We continue. The creak of the door echoed through the night when Jack finally opened it. The icy wind immediately invaded the cabin, bringing with it snowflakes that danced in the heated air. The wolves didn't move, keeping their gazes fixed on him, as if trying to communicate something beyond the immediate need for shelter. "Come," he murmured, surprised by the softness in his own voice. How long had it been since he had spoken to another living being? The animals hesitated for a moment, the larger one still maintaining its protective position in relation to the smaller one. Then, with cautious but determined steps, they crossed the threshold of the door. The contrast between the warmth of the cabin and the extreme cold they had faced seemed to hit them like a wave. Their bodies shook even more intensely now, as if the heat awakened every frozen muscle. Jack quickly closed the door, watching as the wolves instinctively approached the fireplace. In the firelight, he could examine them better. They were undoubtedly maned wolves, a species he knew only from documentaries and books. Their characteristic fur, a golden red, was not only covered in snow, but also tangled and dirty in some spots. The larger of the two limped slightly on its right front paw, while the smaller one showed clear signs of exhaustion and possible malnutrition. Moving cautiously so as not to startle them, Jack went to the small kitchen. He found some pieces of meat he had set aside for his own dinner the next day. Without thinking twice, he put them in a bowl and approached the animals. The larger wolf watched his every movement attentively but showed no aggression. "You can eat," he said, placing the bowl at a safe distance. The larger wolf sniffed the air and, after a few seconds of hesitation, approached the food. However, instead of starting to eat immediately, it gently pushed its smaller companion towards the bowl, in a gesture that made Jack hold his breath. Only after the smaller one began to feed did the larger one allow itself to do the same. As he watched them, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeply unusual about this situation. It wasn't just the fact that maned wolves had sought shelter in his cabin. It was the way they behaved, the intelligence in their gazes, the way they seemed to be fleeing from something more than just cold and hunger. The following hours passed in an almost surreal state. The wolves, after feeding, found a place near the fireplace, lying down on the rustic rug that Jack kept there. The larger one remained alert, occasionally raising its head to observe the door or windows, while the smaller one finally succumbed to fatigue, falling into a deep sleep. Sitting in his armchair, Jack realized that the silence of the night had acquired a new quality. It was no longer the absolute emptiness he was used to, but something alive, filled with the soft breathing of the animals and the occasional crackling of wood in the fire. It was strange how the presence of these unexpected visitors had instantly transformed the atmosphere of the cabin. As the night progressed, his thoughts wandered through unexplored territories. Why had these animals chosen his cabin? How had they found their way through the storm? And why didn't they show the natural fear that their species normally had of humans? Sleep didn't come easily for Jack that night. Every noise from the storm, every movement of the wolves kept his senses on alert. When he finally fell asleep in his armchair, his dreams were populated by hazy images of dark forests and bright eyes in the night. Dawn brought with it a dazzling clarity, a reflection of the sun on the freshly fallen snow. Jack woke up with a sore neck from the uncomfortable position in the armchair, but his eyes immediately sought the nocturnal visitors. The wolves were still there, both awake now, observing him with that same enigmatic look from the night before. Moved by a need to better understand the situation, Jack decided to check the surroundings of the cabin. He put on his heaviest coat and boots appropriate for the snow, noticing how the wolves followed each of his movements with interest. When he opened the door, the cold morning air hit him like a slap. The snow had stopped falling, leaving behind a transformed landscape. The forest surrounding his property seemed to have been covered by a white and immaculate mantle. However, upon closer examination of the area around his cabin, something caught his attention. Among the wolves' footprints, partially covered by the previous night's snow, there were other tracks, marks of human boots. Jack crouched down to examine the footprints better. They were recent, prior to the last snowfall of the night, and formed a circular pattern around the cabin. Whoever it was had carefully studied the place before the wolves appeared. A shiver ran down his spine, and it wasn't because of the cold. As he stood up, he noticed that the wolves had followed him to the porch. The larger one was sniffing the air insistently, its ears moving in different directions, as if trying to capture some distant sound. The smaller one remained close, its posture still showing fatigue, but seemed more alert than the night before. Suddenly, a distant noise caught everyone's attention. It was the unmistakable sound of an engine approaching. Jack frowned. His property was miles away from the nearest road, and snow conditions made access practically impossible for ordinary vehicles. The wolves reacted instantly to the sound. The larger one positioned itself in front of the smaller one, its fur bristling while emitting a low and continuous growl. The other retreated a few steps, seeking the protection of the porch. There was something in their reaction that increased Jack's uneasiness even more. The engine noise was getting closer and closer, and soon Jack could distinguish the characteristic sound of a snowmobile. A few minutes later, a figure emerged from among the trees, skillfully piloting the vehicle through the deep snow. It was a woman, dressed appropriately for the extreme weather, with thermal clothing and equipment that suggested experience in mountain activities. She stopped a few meters from the cabin, turned off the engine, and removed her helmet, revealing a face marked by delicate but determined features. Her dark hair, tied in an elaborate braid, framed penetrating brown eyes that immediately focused on the wolves. For a moment, an expression of relief crossed her countenance. "I finally found them," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. She made as if to approach, but the growl from the larger wolf made her stop. "I didn't expect them to be so defensive." Jack remained where he was, between the wolves and the newcomer. Years of difficult negotiations had taught him to read people, and something in that situation didn't fit perfectly. "Who are you?" he asked, maintaining a neutral but firm tone. "My name is Sarah Winters," she replied, maintaining a respectful distance. "I'm a biologist, specializing in maned wolves. I've been tracking these two for days." She paused, studying Jack's reaction. "I can explain everything, but it would be better if we talked inside. The cold is getting worse, and we need to discuss the situation calmly." Jack hesitated. The woman seemed sincere, and her credentials made sense considering her apparent knowledge about the animals. However, the footprints he had found earlier made him question whether she was telling the whole truth. The wolves in turn remained tense, especially the larger one, which didn't take its eyes off the visitor. "How did you know they were here?" asked Jack, noticing a brief flash of hesitation in Sarah's eyes. "I have tracking equipment," she replied, gesturing to her snowmobile, where various electronic devices were attached. "Part of our conservation study involves monitoring their movement patterns. When I realized they had drastically deviated from their usual route, I got worried." The explanation made sense, but it didn't answer all of Jack's questions. Why did the wolves seem so scared? And why had they specifically sought his cabin as a refuge? Moreover, what other footprints were those in the snow? After a few moments of consideration, Jack nodded towards the door. "All right, we can talk inside." He turned to the wolves, who were watching him attentively. "You too, come." To his surprise, the animals followed him without hesitation, although the larger one maintained a calculated distance from Sarah. Inside the cabin, the heat from the fireplace created an immediate contrast with the external temperature. Sarah removed her gloves and outer coat, revealing a uniform with the logo of a research institution that Jack didn't recognize. She moved with the ease of someone accustomed to challenging situations, but there was something in her behavior that suggested urgency. "Mr. Hawkins," she began, surprising Jack by using his surname, "I know you must be wondering many things, and I promise to explain everything. But first, I need to examine the wolves, especially the smaller one. It seems to be debilitated. Jack crossed his arms, leaning against his work desk. "How do you know my name?" Sarah paused her movements for an instant, and a shadow seemed to cross her face. "That's a long story, Mr. Hawkins, and believe me, when I tell you everything, you'll understand why these wolves specifically chose your cabin to take refuge." The silence that followed Sarah's statement was interrupted only by the crackling of wood in the fireplace. The wolves, now settled near the fire, attentively observed the interaction between the humans. The larger one remained on alert, its ears moving at the slightest noise, while the smaller one seemed to be fighting against sleep. "I'm listening," said Jack, his calm voice masking the tension growing inside him. His years in the corporate world had taught him that sometimes silence was the best tool to make someone talk. Sarah took a deep breath, pulling up a chair to sit down. Her eyes scanned the cabin, lingering for a moment on the closed notebook on Jack's work desk before returning to meet his gaze. "These wolves are not just common specimens," she began, her voice assuming a more professional tone. "The smaller one in particular possesses an extremely rare genetic characteristic, a mutation that could be the key to the species' survival." Jack raised an eyebrow, his interest genuinely piqued. "What kind of mutation?" "One that allows greater resistance to certain diseases that have been decimating maned wolf populations in recent years," explained Sarah, leaning forward. "We discovered this during a routine field study. The problem is that this information leaked and now—" She hesitated, casting a concerned look at the animals. "And now?" pressed Jack, although he was already forming an idea of what was to come. "Now there are people interested in capturing these wolves," Sarah completed, her voice laden with concern. "Not just researchers. There's a thriving black market for rare animals, Mr. Hawkins. People willing to pay fortunes for unique specimens." The pieces were starting to fit together in Jack's mind. The footprints around the cabin, the scared behavior of the wolves, the way they had specifically sought refuge on his property. But there was still something that didn't make sense. "Why my cabin?" he questioned, closely observing Sarah's reaction. "Of all the places in these mountains, why here?" Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her chair. It was evident that she had reached the point she had been trying to avoid. "Because it wasn't a coincidence," she finally admitted. We knew who you were, Mr. Hawkins. Your story is well known in environmentalist circles." Jack frowned, surprised. "What do you mean?" "Your decision to abandon a successful career to live in isolation caught the attention of many people," she explained. "But what few know is that before stepping away, you made considerable anonymous donations to environmental conservation projects, including some aimed at preserving the maned wolf." The revelation hit Jack like a punch to the stomach. He had worked hard to keep those donations secret, considering them a form of compensation for the environmental impact his companies may have caused over the years. It was a part of his past he preferred to keep buried. "When we realized that the hunters were getting close," Sarah continued, "we needed to find a safe place. Your history of supporting the cause, combined with the isolated location of this cabin, made you our best option. But we didn't have time to make proper contact. The hunters were too close. So you guided them here," Jack concluded, the pieces finally fitting together. "Not exactly," Sarah replied, a glimmer of admiration appearing in her eyes. "We created a safe corridor, using pheromones and markers that only the wolves could detect. But it was they who chose to come to your door. There's something about maned wolves, Mr. Hawkins, an intelligence that we still don't fully understand." As Ine. If to confirm her words, the larger wolf stood up and approached Jack, sitting down beside him in a surprising display of trust. Its amber eyes met Jack's, and again he felt that inexplicable connection. "The problem," Sarah continued, her voice assuming a more urgent tone, "is that the hunters haven't given up. The footprints you found are proof of that. They know the wolves are here and they won't stop until they get what they want." A distant sound caught everyone's attention. The larger wolf immediately became alert, its ears pointed towards the window. Sarah quickly got up, moving to peer through the foggy glass. "We have company," she murmured, her pale face reflecting the gravity of the situation. And this time it's not just footprints in the snow. The sound of engines echoed through the forest, getting closer and closer. Sarah moved quickly around the cabin, gathering her equipment with the efficiency of someone accustomed to emergency situations. The wolves were agitated, the larger one circling restlessly while the smaller one huddled near the fireplace. "We need to act fast," said Sarah, checking a small device on her wrist. "By the movement pattern, there are at least 3 snowmobiles. Approaching in a triangular formation. They're trying to surround us." Jack observed through the window, his mind quickly processing the available options. The deep snow severely limited their escape possibilities, and the approaching storm would make visibility increasingly worse. "How much time do we have?" "Minutes," Sarah replied, pulling out a radio from her bag. She tried to make contact, but only got static in response. "As I feared, they're blocking communications." The businessman that existed inside Jack, the one who had faced countless crisis situations in the corporate world, took control. "We need a plan," he declared, moving quickly to his improvised office. "You said these hunters have resources. How much?" "More than we'd like," Sarah answered, following him. "State-of-the-art equipment, adapted military technology, they're not amateurs." Jack turned on his notebook, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "Then let's use that against them." A series of complex commands filled the screen, making Sarah raise her eyebrows in surprise. "I thought you had abandoned technology," she commented, watching him work. "I abandoned the corporate world, not my skills," he responded, without taking his eyes off the screen. "This entire region is covered by a network of sensors that I installed to monitor weather conditions. I can reconfigure the system to—" A sharp crack from outside interrupted his explanation. The wolves reacted instantly, the larger one positioning itself between the door and its companion, which, despite the fatigue, remained alert. "They're closer than we thought," Sarah whispered, moving silently to the window. Through the foggy glass, shadows moved among the trees, taking advantage of the forest cover. Jack continued typing furiously. "Almost ready," he murmured. "If I can redirect the sensor signals, I can create an electronic interference curtain. It will affect their equipment." Sarah alternately observed the window and the wolves, her expression revealing a mixture of concern and determination. "The problem is that they probably have a plan B. People like that always do." As if to confirm her words, a new sound cut through the air, a sharp and growing buzz that made the wolves even more agitated. The larger one began to scratch the wooden floor, while the smaller one emitted a low and anguished whine. "They're drones," Sarah explained, her face paling. "Equipped with thermal cameras, no matter where we hide inside the cabin, they'll find us." Jack finally moved away from the notebook, a glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes. "Not if I can help it." He pressed a final key with emphasis. At the same instant, a sharp hiss filled the air and the buzz of the drones began to falter. "What did you do?" asked Sarah, observing through the window as the small flying devices lost altitude, their electronic systems apparently confused. "I transformed my climate monitoring network into an interference field," Jack explained. "It won't last long. The backup generators can't handle this overload for long, but it should give us a few minutes." Sarah nodded, impressed, but her expression remained tense. "They can still come on foot, and by the movement out there, that's exactly what they're planning." A new sound caught everyone's attention, footsteps in the snow approaching the porch. The wolves tensed, the larger one emitting a low and continuous growl. Sarah pulled something from her bag, a small device that Jack didn't recognize. "Mr. Hawkins," she said, her voice assuming an urgent tone. "There's something I need to tell you about these wolves, something that explains why they're so special and why these people are so determined to capture them." Before she could continue, a deep and authoritative voice resonated from outside. "Dr. Winters, we know you're in there. Are we going to do this the easy way or the hard way?" Sarah exchanged a significant look with Jack. "We don't have much time," she whispered. "But you need to know the truth. These wolves, they're not just genetically unique. They're part of something much bigger, something that could change everything we know about the connection between humans and animals." The silence that followed Sarah's declaration was broken only by the sound of the wind howling outside and the occasional crackling of wood in the fireplace. The wolves remained alert, their eyes fixed on the door, as if they perfectly understood the gravity of the situation. "What exactly are you talking about?" asked Jack, his voice low and controlled, while he continued to monitor the movements outside through his improvised security system. Sarah took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving the wolves. "About a year ago, we started noticing strange patterns in the behavior of these two specifically. At first, we thought it was just an unusual demonstration of social intelligence, something already documented in other species." A new knock on the door momentarily interrupted her explanation. "Last chance, Dr. Winters," the authoritative voice sounded again. Ignoring the threat, Sarah continued, her words now faster and more urgent. "But then, we started to notice something more. They not only demonstrated extraordinary levels of empathy and understanding, but seemed capable of establishing connections, deep connections with certain humans." Jack frowned, remembering the strange sensation he had when looking into the wolves' eyes for the first time. "What kind of connections?" "It's difficult to explain in scientific terms," Sarah replied, pulling out a tablet from her backpack and quickly navigating through a series of graphs and images. "We discovered that their brains present unique neural activity patterns, something never before seen in their species. It's as if they had developed an advanced form of empathic communication." The larger wolf, as if understanding it was being discussed, approached Jack, sitting next to him with a posture that seemed almost protective. The businessman felt again that inexplicable connection, stronger now that he knew it wasn't just his imagination. "That's why they came to me," Jack murmured, the pieces fitting together in his mind. "It wasn't just because you created a safe path. They chose." Sarah nodded emphatically. "Exactly. Your donations for environmental preservation, your decision to abandon everything for a lifestyle more connected with nature, somehow they sensed this. That's why the hunters are so dangerous. They don't just want rare specimens. They want to understand and possibly exploit this unique capability." A metallic sound from outside made everyone startle. The invaders were clearly losing patience. "My interference system won't last much longer," Jack warned, observing the energy levels dropping on his notebook. "We need a plan." Sarah bit her lip, thoughtful. "There's a sanctuary about 25 miles from here in the northern direction. It's a safe, protected location where we could properly study this connection, understand its true potential for species conservation." 25 miles through deep snow with a storm approaching and hunters chasing us?" Jack questioned, although his tone wasn't one of disbelief, but of planning. "I have my snowmobile," Sarah quickly replied, "and you must know these mountains better than anyone now." The smaller wolf approached Jack, gently touching its muzzle to his hand. The gesture, so deliberate and gentle, seemed to carry a deeper meaning than any word could express. "They trust you," said Sarah, observing the interaction with scientific fascination. "In all the months I spent studying them, I never saw them demonstrate this level of trust with anyone." Jack looked at the two animals, then at his notebook, where the red dots indicating the invaders' position blinked threateningly close. Years of business experience had taught him to make difficult decisions under pressure, to calculate risks and opportunities in a matter of seconds. "How long will it take for the storm to arrive?" he asked, already moving towards a cabinet at the back of the cabin. Sarah quickly consulted her equipment. "Less than an hour, it's going to be strong." "Well," said Jack, revealing a set of professional deep snow equipment he kept stored for emergencies, "then we'd better hurry." The sound of something heavy hitting against the door made the wolves growl in unison. Time was running out, and choices were rapidly diminishing. But for the first time in a long time, Jack felt something he had lost since his days in the corporate world: the adrenaline of a true challenge and the absolute certainty of doing the right thing. Jack moved with calculated precision around the cabin, years of experience in corporate crisis management guiding his actions. In minutes he had gathered the essentials: snow equipment, emergency supplies, and a small first aid kit. Sarah, meanwhile, was preparing something with her scientific equipment, her movements equally methodical. "We need to create a distraction," she said, manipulating a small electronic device. "Something that gives us enough time to reach the snowmobile without being seen." The wolves attentively watched every movement, as if they understood the gravity of the situation. The larger one, which they now called Aurora, kept close to the window, monitoring the shadows moving outside, while the smaller one, known as Light, always stayed nearby, its presence a constant reminder of the incredible journey they had shared. "I have an idea," Jack replied, returning to his notebook. "I can overload the backup generators. The energy burst will temporarily fry any electronic equipment within a 100-meter radius, including weapons with electronic sights." Sarah nodded, impressed. "How much time will that give us?" "Minutes at most, but with this storm coming..." Jack gestured to the window, where the first snowflakes were beginning to fall more densely. "It will be enough to disappear into the forest." A new impact on the door, stronger than the previous ones, made the wood creak dangerously. The invaders were losing patience. "Dr. Winters," the authoritative voice sounded again, "don't make this harder than it needs to be. Those wolves are the Institute's property now." Sarah exchanged a significant look with Jack. "They were never anyone's property," she murmured, her voice laden with determination. Jack finished the last adjustments to his system. "Ready?" he asked, his finger hovering over the key that would initiate the overload. Sarah checked her equipment one last time and nodded. The wolves, as if sensing the tension, in the air positioned themselves near the back door of the cabin. "Now!" Jack pressed the key and immediately the lights flickered. A sharp buzz filled the air, followed by a series of crackles and small explosions from outside. The invaders' electronic equipment being overloaded. Taking advantage of the confusion, the group moved quickly. Sarah led the way to her snowmobile, while Jack followed right behind with the wolves. The biting wind and the increasingly dense snow provided the additional cover they needed. "Quick!" Sarah whispered, already starting the engine of her snowmobile. The sound was partially muffled by the intensifying storm. Jack helped the smaller wolf climb onto the small sled attached to the vehicle, while the larger one agilely jumped to his side. Shouts of confusion echoed from the front of the cabin. Their plan had worked. The invaders were temporarily blinded, their equipment rendered useless by the electrical overload. "Where to?" asked Sarah, as soon as Jack settled behind her on the snowmobile. "North," he answered, adjusting his protective goggles. "I know a path through the valley that will give us cover, but we have to be fast. This storm is going to get much worse soon." Sarah accelerated the snowmobile, and the group plunged into the darkness of the forest. The snow was falling more and more densely, creating a white blanket that made it difficult to distinguish where the sky ended and the earth began. The wolves kept close to the vehicle, the larger one running with surprising strength and agility, considering its previous state. Through the howling of the wind, Jack could hear the distant sound of engines. The invaders had managed to start their own snowmobiles and were beginning the pursuit. But he knew these mountains like the back of his hand now. 2 years of isolation had taught him every trail, every secret passage between the centuries-old trees. "There!" he shouted over the roar of the wind, pointing to an almost invisible passage between two rock formations. "That ravine will lead us to the valley." Sarah skillfully guided the snowmobile through the narrow opening, the wolves following their steps with impressive precision. The passage was tight, barely allowing the vehicle to pass, but that's exactly what made it perfect. The pursuers' larger snowmobiles would have difficulty following them. The sound of the pursuing engines began to diminish, but Jack knew they couldn't slow down. The storm was rapidly transforming into a complete blizzard, and even with his knowledge of the terrain, it would soon be impossible to orient themselves. That's when something extraordinary happened. Aurora, the larger wolf, running alongside the snowmobile, began to actively guide them, choosing paths that seemed imperceptible to human eyes. Its movements were precise, deliberate, as if it knew not only the terrain but also the weather, predicting where the snow would be firmer or more treacherous. "Amazing," Sarah murmured, following the animal's lead. "They're guiding us. This is exactly what I was talking about. This connection capability goes beyond anything we've ever documented." Jack watched in wonder as they traversed the forest, humans and wolves working in perfect synchrony. The storm raged around them, but inside him a certainty grew. His decision to abandon his previous life had prepared him exactly for this moment. The blizzard intensified with each passing minute, transforming the world around them into a whirlwind of white. Visibility was reduced to a few meters, and the biting cold penetrated even through the thick protective clothing. However, Aurora continued to guide the group with supernatural confidence, choosing paths that seemed impossible to detect. Amidst the chaos of the storm, how can they orient themselves in this weather? Jack shouted to Sarah, his voice almost lost in the howling wind. "It's more than just orientation," she replied, keeping the snowmobile steady on the trail indicated by the wolf. "Their senses are extraordinary, but what we're seeing goes beyond that. It's as if they could predict the safest path." Light, still on the sled, remained surprisingly calm despite the extreme conditions. Its attentive eyes alternated between its companion in front and the surrounding forest, as if it too was actively participating in the navigation. Suddenly, Aurora stopped, its ears moving in different directions. Seconds later, a distant sound reached human ears, the echo of engines cutting through the storm. "They're still following us," Sarah alerted, quickly checking her instruments. "How is that possible in this storm?" Jack frowned, his mind working rapidly. "They must have special equipment. Military technology, you said." He observed the surroundings, trying to orient himself. "How far to the sanctuary?" "By my estimate, about 15 miles, Sarah replied. "But with this storm..." Before she could complete the sentence, Aurora emitted a low and urgent sound. Its companion on the sled responded immediately, and both seemed agitated. "What is it?" Jack asked, feeling that something was wrong. As if in response, a distant rumble echoed through the forest. Sarah paled. "Avalanche," she whispered. "The storm must have destabilized some slope." Aurora began to move again, this time in a different direction from the one they were following. Its behavior was even more urgent now. "Should we follow it?" Sarah asked, hesitant. Jack had no doubts. "Yes, they know something we don't." Sarah redirected the snowmobile, following the new path indicated by the wolf. The sound of the pursuing engines was getting closer, but now there was another sound mixing with the storm, a growing roar that made the very air vibrate. That's when Jack understood the wolves' plan. Ahead, partially visible through the curtain of snow, a rock formation created a natural shelter, a small cave that would be imperceptible to anyone who didn't know exactly its location. "There!" he shouted, pointing. "That cave will protect us!" They had barely reached the shelter when the roar transformed into a deafening thunder. The avalanche, triggered by the storm and possibly by the sound of the engines, swept down the mountainside with devastating force. From inside the cave, the group watched the mass of snow and ice pass like a furious river, completely blocking the path they had just abandoned. The sound of the pursuing engines was abruptly silenced. They knew, Sarah murmured, looking at the wolves with a mixture of astonishment and scientific admiration. "Somehow they predicted the avalanche and brought us to the only safe place in the area." Aurora approached Jack, gently touching its muzzle to the man's hand. The connection between them seemed stronger than ever, transcending the need for words. "It's not just prediction," said Jack, finally understanding. "It's something deeper. They understand the mountain, the forest, nature itself, in a way that goes beyond physical senses." Sarah nodded, making quick notes on her tablet. "That's why they're so special, and why we need to protect them. Imagine what we could learn about environmental preservation, about animal consciousness itself, by studying this unique connection." The howling of the wind began to gradually diminish, the storm losing strength after releasing its fury through the avalanche. Light descended from the sled, moving with more vigor than it had shown until then, as if the proximity of the sanctuary gave it new strength. "The avalanche gave us an advantage," Jack observed. It completely blocked the path our pursuers were using. Even if they escaped, it will take them hours to find an alternative route. Then it's our chance, said Sarah, checking the snowmobile's fuel levels. As soon as the storm passes a bit, more we can continue. The sanctuary isn't far now. While they waited for the right moment to proceed, Jack observed the two wolves. They had settled close to each other but remained alert, their senses attuned to the mountain around them. For the first time since abandoning his previous life, he felt that he had found something truly meaningful, a connection that transcended common human understanding, a greater purpose that justified every decision that had brought him here. The storm had diminished to a gentle snow when the group finally left the cave. Aurora once again led the way, its movements more confident. Now that visibility had improved, Sarah guided the snowmobile with renewed precision, while Jack kept his senses alert for any sign of pursuit. "I need to tell you more about the sanctuary," said Sarah, her voice carrying a note of urgency. "It's not just a common preservation site." Jack adjusted his position on the snowmobile, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "It's a revolutionary project," she explained, skillfully avoiding a fallen tree. "It started as a traditional reserve, but evolved into something much bigger when we began to observe this unique behavior in the wolves." Light, still on the sled, pricked up its ears as if recognizing the conversation. Its larger companion maintained a steady pace ahead, occasionally stopping to sniff the air or study the terrain. "The sanctuary was redesigned specifically to study and protect this special connection," Sarah continued. "We have a multidisciplinary team, biologists, animal behavior specialists, neuroscientists, all working to understand how this empathic communication works." "And what have you discovered so far?" asked Jack, genuinely interested. Sarah hesitated for a moment, as if carefully, choosing her words. "We've discovered that it's not just these two. Other maned wolves have started to demonstrate similar abilities, although not as developed. It's as if an accelerated evolution of the species was happening." The path began to climb, the snowmobile facing a gentle but constant incline. The wolves naturally adjusted their pace, keeping close to the vehicle. "But there's more," Sarah continued, her voice lowering slightly. "We started noticing subtle changes in the people who work directly with these animals. Greater intuition, deeper connection with the natural environment, increased ability to predict climate changes." Jack thought about his own experience of the last few hours, the way he had felt an instant connection with the wolves, how he had trusted his instincts in a way he would never have considered in his previous life. "The institute those men work for," he said, beginning to understand, "they don't just want to study the wolves, they want to replicate this ability." "Exactly," Sarah confirmed. "Imagine the commercial value of something like this. The ability to develop a deep empathic connection with nature. The applications would be endless." A stronger gust of wind brought with it a distant sound, a helicopter. Aurora stopped abruptly, its ears moving in all directions. "Impossible," Sarah murmured, quickly checking her instruments. "No aircraft should be able to fly in these conditions." "Unless they have advanced military technology," Jack completed, his corporate mind quickly assessing the situation. "How far to the sanctuary?" "Less than 6 miles now, but..." Sarah was interrupted by a sharp sound coming from her equipment. "Oh no! What is it?" "I just received an alert from the sanctuary," she replied, her face pale. "There's been an invasion. The Institute, they got there first." Aurora emitted a low sound, almost like a moan, while its companion on the sled visibly agitated. The connection between their behavior and the bad news was clear. "There must be another place," said Jack, refusing to give up. "Some safe location where we can take them." Sarah bit her lip, thoughtful. Maybe there is, but it's risky." She looked at the wolves as if seeking confirmation. "There's an old research station, abandoned years ago. It's high up on the mountain, almost inaccessible this time of year." "Why abandoned?" asked Jack, though he already suspected the answer. "It was considered too dangerous," Sarah replied. "The weather conditions are extreme, and access is practically impossible during winter, but..." She made a significant pause. "It was there that we observed the first signs of this special connection in the wolves." The sound of the helicopter was closer now, Soon they would be visible, even with the snow that was still falling. Jack observed the wolves. Aurora had approached the sled, briefly touching its companion with its muzzle, in a gesture that seemed both comforting and determined. "The station," he finally said. "How do we get there?" Sarah pointed to a distant elevation, partially visible through the mist. "That peak, there's an old trail that leads up there, but with this snow..." Before she could complete, Aurora began to move, taking a slightly different direction from the one they were following. Its behavior was decisive, as if it knew exactly where to go. "I think we just got our answer," said Jack, a small smile forming on his lips. "They know the way." Sarah nodded, repositioning the snowmobile in the new direction. "You're right. If there's a safe route up there in the midst of this storm, they'll find it." The group began to climb, leaving behind the path that led to the invaded sanctuary. The sound of the helicopter continued to echo through the mountain, but now it seemed more distant. They were still searching in the wrong direction. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Tell us which city you're watching us from. We continue. The climb to the old research station proved more challenging with each meter gained. The wind had begun to gain strength again, though not as violent as before, and the deep snow made each movement of the snowmobile a battle against nature. However, the wolves continued to guide the group with a supernatural certainty, choosing paths that, although not seeming obvious at first, always proved to be the safest. "There," Sarah suddenly shouted, pointing through the mist. A structure began to materialize ahead, a low, wide building, partially covered in snow, its dark windows reflecting the little daylight that remained. As they approached, Jack could see why. The station had been abandoned. Its location was truly isolated, situated on a kind of natural plateau that seemed to defy the mountain itself. The wind was even stronger up here, howling through the exposed metal structures of the building. "Doesn't look very welcoming," Jack commented as Sarah guided the snowmobile to a structure that must have once been a garage. "It was built to withstand," she replied, turning off the engine. "The problem was never the structure itself, but keeping it supplied. Access is practically impossible for half the year." The wolves had already moved to the main entrance, Aurora sniffing the door with interest while Light observed the horizon, as if standing guard. Their behavior continued to surprise Jack. It was impossible not to notice the almost military coordination of their actions. Sarah worked quickly on the electronic panel beside the door. "I hope it still works," she murmured, connecting a small device from her backpack. After a few tense seconds, a metallic click echoed through the air and the door opened with a creak. The interior of the station was cold and dark, but surprisingly well preserved. Layers of dust covered the abandoned equipment, creating an almost ghostly atmosphere. Sarah moved with familiarity through the space, quickly locating the main power panel. "The energy system is independent," she explained, manipulating some controls. "Solar cells and wind generators. Theoretically, it should still..." The lights flickered a few times before stabilizing, revealing an extensive and well-equipped laboratory, although clearly dated. The wolves entered cautiously, their fur still covered in melting snow slowly thawing in the now heated environment. Aurora remained alert, while Light seemed more relaxed, as if recognizing the place. "It was here," said Sarah, moving between the benches with a mixture of nostalgia and reverence. "It was here that everything began, 5 years ago." "What exactly happened?" asked Jack, watching as she reactivated some equipment. Sarah took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts. "We were studying migration patterns of maned wolves in the region. It was a simple, traditional project, but then we started noticing anomalies in the data. The wolves were demonstrating behaviors that defied everything we knew about the species." She moved to a dusty file cabinet, pulling out some old folders. "At first we thought they were just adaptations to the extreme environment, but then..." She opened one of the folders, revealing graphs and handwritten notes. "We started recording unusual brain activities, patterns that resembled higher primates more than canids." Aurora approached, its eyes fixed on the papers as if understanding their importance. Sarah smiled softly. Yes, you were here, weren't you? You were one of the first we observed. Jack frowned, surprised. This same wolf? Yes, Sarah confirmed. He was just a pup at the time, but already showing signs of the mutation. The real surprise came when we realized that he was, somehow, transmitting this capability to other members of the species. As if to illustrate her point, Light approached its companion, and for a moment their gazes met in a way that seemed to carry a deep and complex communication. It's like a network, Sarah continued, her voice laden with scientific admiration. They not only developed an advanced form of communication among themselves, but also a unique ability to establish empathic connections with receptive humans. Like me, Jack murmured, remembering the inexplicable sensation he had at first contact with the wolves. Exactly, Sarah nodded. Your decision to abandon corporate life, to seek a deeper connection with nature, that probably made you more receptive to this type of communication. A distant sound made everyone freeze. The helicopter was approaching again. They won't give up easily, said Sarah, moving quickly to turn off some of the lights. The Institute invested a lot in this research. The possibility of replicating this mutation, of creating a form of empathic communication that could be controlled and commercialized, would be revolutionary, Jack completed, his business mind immediately understanding the implications, but also incredibly dangerous in the wrong hands. The wolves moved restlessly, their ears attentive to the growing sound of the helicopter. Aurora began to sniff the air more intensely, moving towards a side corridor. He wants to show us something, said Sarah, already following the animal. This station has miles of underground tunnels, originally built for geological research. If he knows a path through them. The sound of the helicopter was now directly above them. There was no more time for hesitation. With a quick nod, Jack followed Sarah and the wolves down the dark corridor, leaving behind the illuminated laboratory. As they walked, he couldn't help but think about how his life had completely changed in less than 24 hours. The underground tunnels of the station were a labyrinth of narrow passages and occasional chambers, illuminated only by Sarah's flashlight and Jack's cell phone. The air was cold and damp, laden with the weight of years of abandonment. The wolves moved with surprising confidence through the darkness, Aurora always in front, choosing paths with a certainty that seemed impossible for those who didn't know the place. These tunnels were used for more than just geological research, weren't they? Asked Jack, noticing the various abandoned equipment and installations that seemed out of place for a simple soil studies project. Sarah hesitated before answering, her flashlight briefly illuminating a series of dust-covered electronic panels. You're observant, she finally said. Actually, this complex was initially built as a bunker during the Cold War. The research project came later, taking advantage of the existing infrastructure. Light, which was moving close to Jack, suddenly stopped, its ears moving in alert. Seconds later, a distant tremor reverberated through the rocky walls. They've landed, Sarah murmured, consulting a small device on her wrist, and by the vibration pattern, it wasn't just one helicopter. How long until they find us? Asked Jack, his mind already calculating possibilities. It depends. These tunnels are complex, with several levels and ramifications, without a guide. She looked significantly at the wolves. It could take days to explore everything. As if understanding the conversation, Aurora began to move more quickly, guiding them through a series of curves and bifurcations that would have been impossible to navigate without its leadership. He's taking us somewhere specific, Sarah observed, her tone mixing scientific curiosity and urgency. But I can't understand. This area wasn't in the original station plans. The passage began to descend more steeply, the air becoming even colder. The tunnel walls changed, passing from reinforced concrete to natural rock, as if they had reached an older and more primitive part of the complex. Suddenly, Aurora stopped. They were in front of a heavy metal door, partially hidden by natural rock formations. Unlike other doors they had passed, this one seemed to have been deliberately camouflaged. Impossible, Sarah whispered, approaching to examine the door. This shouldn't be here. There are no records of anything beyond level B3, but this is much deeper. Jack watched as she studied the opening mechanism, an old but sophisticated electronic system for its time. Can you open it? Theoretically, she replied, already connecting some equipment. The system is similar to the main entrance, just more. A new tremor, stronger than the previous one, interrupted her speech. This time it was accompanied by distant sounds of voices and equipment. "They're moving fast," said Jack, his voice tense. The wolves also noticed the change. Aurora positioned itself between the group and the path they had come from, while Light remained close to the door, as if anxious to cross it. Sarah worked quickly, her fingers dancing over the improvised device she had connected to the panel. Almost. A metallic click echoed through the tunnel, followed by the sound of ancient mechanisms coming back to life. "I got it!" The door began to open slowly, revealing a chamber beyond. As soon as the opening was sufficient, the wolves slipped inside, clearly familiar with the space. Jack and Sarah followed them, closing the door behind them. The chamber was surprisingly large, and as soon as Sarah directed her flashlight to the interior, both held their breath. The walls were covered with old scientific equipment, but what truly caught attention were the data panels and old photographs. Dozens of images of manned wolves' brain activity graphs and detailed notes about something called Project Synthesis. "My God," Sarah murmured, approaching one of the panels. This is from decades ago. They already knew. They were already studying this connection long before us." Jack examined some of the notes, his experience in technology allowing him to understand part of the terminology. "It wasn't just study," he said, his tone grave. "They were trying to artificially replicate the phenomenon, create a form of controlled, empathic communication." Aurora approached a specific area of the chamber, calling their attention with a low sound. When Sarah directed the flashlight, they saw something that made their hearts race. A series of documents detailing experiments, successes and failures, and more importantly, a complete map of all the underground facilities, including an emergency exit that led to a completely different point of the mountain from where they were. "Now I understand," said Sarah, her voice barely containing the emotion of the discovery. "It wasn't a coincidence they brought us here. They weren't just fleeing. They were guiding us to this information." Sarah moved quickly through the secret chamber, photographing documents and collecting information with the efficiency of a scientist accustomed to working under pressure. Jack, meanwhile, studied the detailed map of the facilities, memorizing routes and alternative exits. The wolves remained alert, especially Aurora, which occasionally turned its attention to the door through which they had entered. "This changes everything," said Sarah, examining a particular set of documents. "The current institute, they're not the first to try to control this ability. There were previous attempts decades ago." "And what happened?" asked Jack, although he suspected the answer. "It failed," she replied, quickly scanning the notes. "The scientists of the time discovered that they couldn't force the connection. The more they tried to control it artificially, the more it deteriorated. It was like trying to capture water with a net." A distant sound made everyone freeze. The wolves immediately became more alert, their ears moving in different directions. "They're getting closer," Jack murmured, consulting the map again. "How long do you need to collect everything that's important?" "I already have the essentials," Sarah replied, storing her equipment. "But there's something else here, something that explains why these two wolves in particular are so special." She moved to a specific section of the chamber, illuminating a series of old photographs. In one of them, a manned wolf pup was clearly visible, its eyes presenting the same unique glow that characterized Aurora. "It's him," said Sarah, her voice laden with admiration. "The same wolf. He not only survived the original experiments, but somehow evolved with them, and now he's passing this knowledge on." Light approached its companion, and again that silent and deep communication seemed to pass between them. Jack could feel, stronger than ever, the special connection that united them. The original scientists came to an interesting conclusion. Sarah continued, her eyes rapidly scanning the last notes. They realized that the true strength of this ability wasn't in control, but in collaboration. The wolves weren't passive subjects of an experiment. They were active participants, choosing with whom and how to share their capability. "That's why they chose my cabin," Jack understood. It wasn't just because it was safe or because you had created a path. They chose me. Sarah nodded. Your decision to abandon a life of control and power, to seek a deeper connection with nature, that must have resonated with them in some way we don't yet fully understand. A new tremor, closer now, reverberated through the chamber walls. Aurora immediately moved towards a specific area of the wall, sniffing insistently. The map shows an emergency passage there, said Jack, consulting the document. It should lead us to an exit on the north face of the mountain, completely opposite to the main station. And far enough from the helicopters, Sarah completed, already gathering her equipment. But how are we going to open it? It must have been sealed for decades. As if in response, Aurora began to scratch a specific area of the wall. Jack approached, examining the spot with his light. There was a small protrusion, almost imperceptible, a manual emergency mechanism, he murmured, studying the device. Independent of power, probably designed exactly for situations like this. Working together, Jack and Sarah managed to activate the mechanism. With a metallic creak, a section of the wall began to move, revealing a narrow but apparently stable tunnel. "Quick," said Sarah, consulting her wrist device. "The vibrations are getting stronger. They must have advanced scanning equipment." The wolves were already moving through the newly revealed tunnel, once again guiding the way with that supernatural confidence. Jack and Sarah followed them, closing the passage behind them. The new tunnel was different from the previous ones, more primitive, excavated directly into the rock. The air was colder and damper, but there was a constant current that suggested a connection to the outside. "You know what's most interesting," Sarah said as they advanced. "In the documents there was mention of other places like this, other facilities where similar experiments were conducted." "You think there are more wolves like these?" Jack asked. "Not just that," she replied, her voice mixing scientific excitement with concern. "I think they're connecting, forming a communication network that goes far beyond what we imagined possible." The tunnel began to gradually ascend, and fresher air indicated they were approaching the exit. The wolves maintained a steady pace, occasionally stopping to ensure their human companions could keep up. "If this is true," said Jack, his mind processing the implications, "then we're not just protecting two special wolves." "Exactly," Sarah completed. "We're protecting the beginning of something much bigger, something that could completely change our understanding of animal consciousness and our connection to the natural world." The emergency tunnel snaked through the mountain like an ancient scar in the rock. The air grew colder as they climbed, and occasional wind currents indicated they were approaching the surface. The wolves maintained a constant rhythm, their movements sure even in the near total darkness illuminated only by Jack and Sarah's lights. "Wait," Sarah suddenly said, stopping to consult her tablet. "I need to check something in the documents I photographed." Jack stopped beside her, taking the moment to catch his breath. Aurora returned to them, while Light kept guard a few meters ahead. "What is it?" Jack asked, noticing Sarah's concentrated expression. "These reports," she answered, quickly scrolling through several images on her device. "There's something about an Aurora protocol. It was part of the original project, but was abandoned when they decided to close the facility." A distant tremor reminded them that they couldn't linger too long. The pursuers were still there, probably using advanced equipment to map all the mountain's tunnels. "And what was this protocol?" Jack pressed, his years of business experience making him recognize the importance of seemingly small information. "It was extraordinary," Sarah replied, her eyes shining with scientific admiration. "They discovered that the wolves not only developed empathic connections among themselves and with specific humans, but could also influence other animals in the region. It was as if they were creating a network of natural consciousness." Aurora moved closer, its amber eyes fixed on Sarah as if it understood every word. Light emitted a low sound from its lookout post, drawing everyone's attention. "The protocol was developed to study and potentially amplify this ability," Sarah continued, her voice now more urgent. "But something went wrong, or rather, something went too right. The wolves began to demonstrate levels of intelligence and communication that frightened the researchers of the time. That's why they closed everything," Jack concluded. They lost control of the experiment. Not exactly, Sarah corrected. They realized that they couldn't control something that was fundamentally about freedom and natural connection. The true success of the project wasn't in creating an ability that could be controlled, but in allowing it to develop naturally. A new sound echoed through the tunnel, closer now, metallic and rhythmic. The wolves immediately became more alert, Aurora assuming a defensive posture. "They have excavation equipment," said Sarah, quickly storing her tablet. "They must be trying to open new accesses to the tunnels." Jack consulted the mental map he had made of the escape route. "How far to the exit?" "Not far," Sarah replied, "but there's something else we need to do before, something the original scientists planned but never had a chance to implement." She pulled from her backpack a small device that looked like a mixture of modern scientific equipment and old technology. "I found the specifications in the files. It's a brainwave amplifier designed specifically for the unique frequency these wolves emit." Aurora approached the device, sniffing it with evident interest. Its smaller companion also approached, as if attracted by something only they could perceive. "What exactly does this do?" Jack asked, watching fascinated as Sarah adjusted some controls. "In theory," she explained, "it can temporarily amplify their communication ability, not just between themselves, but with the entire natural network they've created. If it works..." A stronger rumble interrupted her explanation. The tunnel shook slightly, and small rocks detached from the ceiling. "We don't have much time," Jack said, his voice tense but controlled. "What do we need to do?" Sarah finished adjusting the device. "We need to reach the tunnel exit. The amplifier needs open sky to work properly. And more importantly," she looked directly at the wolves, "they need to want to do this. It has to be their choice." As if responding, both wolves positioned themselves closer to the device. Their eyes, shining in the tunnel's penumbra, seemed to carry an ancient and deep determination. "I think we already have our answer," Jack said, a small smile forming on his lips. "They knew about this all along, didn't they? That's why they brought us here." Sarah nodded, marveling. "Their connection, it's deeper than we ever imagined. We're not just witnessing a biological evolution, but something much more significant." The tunnel shook again, and the sound of heavy equipment grew closer. Without need for words, the group began to move more quickly towards the exit. The wolves led the way with renewed urgency, as if they knew they were about to participate in something truly extraordinary. The emergency tunnel exit opened onto a small, natural platform on the north face of the mountain. The wind was cutting, but the blizzard had diminished, revealing a sky that was beginning to clear with the first lights of dawn. The wolves emerged first, their reddish fur shining softly in the growing light. Sarah immediately began to prepare the amplifier device, her movements precise despite the intense cold. Jack kept guard at the tunnel entrance, alert to any sign of approach from the pursuers. "How much time do you need?" he asked, hearing distant sounds of equipment echoing through the passage. "Just a few minutes," Sarah replied, connecting a series of small antennas to the main device. "The most important thing now is to position everything correctly. The wolves need to be within the resonance field." As if they perfectly understood, the two animals naturally positioned themselves at specific points on the platform. Aurora maintained a proud posture, its eyes scanning the horizon, while light seemed more concentrated, almost meditative. "Amazing," Sarah murmured, observing her instruments. "The readings, they're already emitting synchronized brainwave patterns. It's as if they're preparing." The sound of equipment grew louder, echoing through the tunnel. They didn't have much time. "Sarah," Jack called urgently, "what exactly is going to happen when you activate this?" She made the final adjustments before answering. "Honestly, I'm not absolutely sure. The Aurora protocol was never fully implemented, but according to the theory..." She looked at the wolves with a mixture of admiration and expectation. "It should amplify their communication ability to an unprecedented level." A stronger tremor shook the mountain, and the sound of machines was now dangerously close. The wolves, however, remained perfectly calm, as if nothing else mattered beyond the moment that was about to come. "Now," said Sarah, her fingers hovering over the main control of the device, "we just need to wait for the exact moment. The alignment with the sunrise will maximize the effect of the resonance field. The first rays of sun began to appear on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold. The snow glittered like thousands of tiny diamonds, creating a light spectacle that seemed almost supernatural. It was then that something extraordinary began to happen. Even before Sarah activated the device, the wolves began to emit a low and melodious sound, unlike anything Jack had ever heard. It wasn't a common howl. It was something deeper, more harmonic. "The brain patterns," Sarah whispered, observing her instruments in amazement. "They're amplifying naturally. It's as if they were connecting," Jack completed, feeling something strange and wonderful in the air. It was as if the very environment around them was responding to the wolves' call. Sarah activated the device, and the effect was immediate and spectacular. The sound emitted by the wolves gained a new dimension, reverberating through the valley below. And then, to the absolute astonishment of both humans, responses began to emerge. From the forest below, other howls began to rise, first distant, then increasingly closer. It wasn't just manned wolves, it was various animals from the region, each contributing its own voice to a natural symphony that grew in complexity and beauty. "It's a chain reaction," Sarah explained, her voice barely containing the emotion. "They're activating the natural communication network they've built over the years. Each animal that responds becomes part of something bigger." The sun continued to rise, and with it, the intensity of the phenomenon increased. Jack could feel something changing in the very air, an almost palpable energy that seemed to connect everything and everyone. "The sensors are registering synchronized neural activity in a radius of miles," said Sarah, checking her equipment. "It's as if the entire region was awakening." Aurora turned its impressive eyes to Jack, and at that moment he felt the connection stronger than ever. It wasn't just thoughts or emotions, it was a deep and fundamental understanding of the interconnection of all things. "They're not just communicating," he said, finally understanding. "They're reminding all of us of something we forgot long ago. Nature was never something to be controlled or studied from the outside. It's something we're part of." The sound of heavy equipment in the tunnel had completely ceased. It was as if even the pursuers had been affected by the extraordinary phenomenon unfolding. Sarah nodded, tears of emotion shining in her eyes. The Aurora Protocol was never about creating something new. It was about rediscovering something ancient, something that had always been there, waiting for us to be ready to listen. The sun finally emerged completely on the horizon, bathing the mountain in golden light. The wolves maintained their ancestral song, now part of a much larger symphony that echoed through the mountains. It was the beginning of something new, and at the same time, the return to something deeply familiar. Connection that transcended the barriers between species and touched something fundamental in the very essence of life. 3 months passed since that extraordinary morning on the mountain. The old research station had been transformed into a Center for Animal Communication Studies, now officially protected by various international environmental organizations. Sarah led a multidisciplinary team of scientists, all dedicated to understanding and preserving the unique phenomenon they had witnessed. Jack observed the sunset from the porch of his cabin, which now served as an outpost for the project. Aurora and Light rested nearby, their reddish fur shining with the last golden rays of the day. They were no longer fugitives, they were ambassadors of something much greater than anyone could have imagined. "The latest data is fascinating," said Sarah, coming out of the cabin with a steaming cup of tea. "The communication network they established continues to expand. We've already identified similar patterns in 3 other different regions of the country." Jack smiled, observing how Aurora raised its head upon hearing Sarah's voice. Light always stayed close by, its presence a constant reminder of the incredible journey they had shared. "And the Institute?" Jack asked, although he already knew the answer. "Completely restructured," Sarah replied, sitting in a nearby chair. "After the discoveries from the old station came to light, along with evidence of their questionable practices, they had no choice but to change their approach. Now they work in collaboration with us, focusing on preservation instead of control. The Puri, gentle wind carried with it the sounds of the forest, a natural symphony that, to trained ears like theirs had become, carried more meaning than they had ever imagined possible. Occasionally, a distant howl echoed through the mountains, part of the growing dialogue between the different species of the region. "You know what's most interesting?" Sarah continued, her face illuminated by the scientific enthusiasm that never abandoned her. "We're discovering that this connection capability isn't exclusive to manned wolves. They were just the first to manifest it so evidently. It's as if they had opened a door that had always been there, waiting to be discovered." Jack nodded, remembering his own journey. "Maybe that's why I felt so compelled to abandon my previous life," he reflected. "Some part of me knew there was something deeper to be discovered." Aurora stood up and approached Jack, gently touching its muzzle to his hand, a gesture that had become familiar, but never lost its special meaning. Through that simple touch, Jack could feel the complex web of connections that now permeated the region, a living network of consciousness and communication that grew each day. "The new conservation protocols we've developed are being implemented in other reserves," said Sarah, consulting some notes on her tablet. "The idea that we should preserve not only the animals, but also their natural communication networks, is revolutionizing the way we think about environmental protection." The sun finally disappeared behind the mountains, and the first stars began to dot the sky. Light joined its companion near the humans, and for a moment they all shared a comfortable silence, connected by something that transcended words. "Sometimes I wonder," Jack said softly, "if they knew from the beginning that this would happen. If when they knocked on my door that stormy night, they already had a greater understanding of what was to come." Sarah smiled, observing the wolves with affection. "I think they always knew more than we imagined. They weren't just fleeing or seeking shelter, they were guiding us to something bigger." As if to confirm her words, Aurora and Light simultaneously raised their heads and emitted a harmonic howl that echoed through the nascent night. Within seconds, responses began to emerge from the forest, a chorus of different voices that united in a music that spoke of connection, renewal, and hope. Jack closed his eyes, letting himself be enveloped by that natural symphony. His decision to abandon the corporate world, which so many considered madness, had transformed into the first step of a much greater journey than he could have imagined. Now, his solitary cabin in the mountains was no longer a refuge from the world, but a meeting point between different forms of life and consciousness. "The most incredible thing," said Sarah, her voice blending scientific admiration with reverence, "is that this is just the beginning. Each day, we discover new forms of communication, new connections being established. It's as if we were witnessing the awakening of something that always existed, just waiting for us to be ready to perceive it." The night advanced, bringing with it a deep peace that seemed to emanate from the mountain itself. Aurora and Light returned to settle near the porch, their eyes shining with that ancient wisdom they had learned to recognize. They were no longer just two special wolves. They were guardians of precious knowledge, teachers of a language that humanity was just beginning to relearn. "The sunrise," said Jack, "was never the same after that morning." He smiled, gently caressing Aurora's fur. "Each dawn brings with it the promise of new discoveries, new connections." Sarah nodded, standing up to observe the stars that now shone in all their splendor. "And to think that it all began with a knock on the door on a stormy night." The wolves emitted a soft sound, almost like a contented sigh. The night breeze carried the sounds of the living forest around them, a natural orchestra of which they were now part, a constant reminder that, in the end, all things are connected in an eternal dance of life and renewal. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope that the journey of Jack, Sarah, and the extraordinary manned wolves has touched your hearts. To continue exploring equally fascinating stories about the surprising connections between humans and nature, we invite you to subscribe to our channel. Leave your likes and share in the comments your own experiences of connection with the natural world. Each day we bring new narratives that reveal the hidden magic in our world. Together we can rediscover the ancient languages that unite us to all forms of life. See you at the next encounter.